Hey folks, this is John, and today we're going to build our first virtual machine together. But before we do that, I want to prime your brain a little bit. I want you to be thinking about what your needs are so that as we go through this, you'll be connecting the dots. You'll really be seeing this is important and this is not to me, and how you can get the most benefit out of this. So ask yourself some questions. What's important to you? Do you need to be able to support a lot of different kinds of software? Or maybe just a couple different kinds of software that don't play well together? Do you need to be able to support old automation equipment that maybe has programming software that only runs on a 32-bit or, heaven forbid, a 16-bit computer? Do you need an IT-free zone? Do you have software that's sensitive to different kinds of IT-controlled things like antivirus, user account control? Or do you just need a good recovery option, a way to get back to square one if anything ever goes wrong? My approach when I'm looking at virtual machines, I talk a lot about Rockwell, but I do Omron and GE and any kind of PLC I can get my hands on, I'll program it. So I've got to deal with very old software, sometimes 16-bit, and I have a Windows XP 32-bit machine that I run all the old software on. Then everything newer, I just put on a Windows 7 64-bit virtual machine. And that really covers all of my needs. If I ever need to separate two pieces of new software that don't want to play together, I can use snapshots to do that. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So with that out of the way, we need to get ourselves a laptop. Let's go shopping. Just to make things simple, I picked a manufacturer and I'm going to start picking a line of laptop here. 14 inch is a little small for programming. Let's go with a 15.6. That sounds great. So here are the submodels in that category. Now, most of the things that we get to choose here are really more about your programming preferences than actual virtual machines. This looks good. It's got the screen I want. It's got a processor that I like. So let's say customize and add. Okay, now we get to pick all the fun details. Memory, this is very important. I would say if you're going to run virtual machines, 8 gigs is bare minimum. 16 gigs is pretty good. And again, if we're talking about what I'm doing, I actually go with a 24 gig system for my programming computer because I like to be able to run several virtual machines at the same time if I need to, and I wanted a little space for future expansion. Graphics is not particularly important, so I'm happy with the integrated graphics. Hard drive, this is another important factor. Now consider when you're running a virtual machine, first you have to boot your physical machine into Windows or whatever operating system you're using. And then you have to boot your virtual machines. You're doubling your boot time right now. So I would say absolutely get a solid state drive. It speeds that up a lot. My preference is to go for 500 or so. Seems like a good balance between cost and being able to fit things on my hard drive. And that's really all that's important here. The rest is, again, your preference. Now that we looked at what hardware to get, I wanted to talk through a little bit of terminology and reasoning why we got that hardware. So this drawing that I have here represents basically what you're used to seeing when you have a computer. The host is the word that we use to describe the physical hardware and the operating system that rides on top of that physical hardware. So you'll frequently hear me say host machine. This is what I'm talking about. You buy a laptop, it's got so much RAM and so much hard drive space, whatever processor we picked. That's the host, that's the physical machine. Now, when we get a piece of virtualization software like Vmware Workstation or Oracle VirtualBox, what we're really doing is we're creating virtual hardware. And we call this the guest. There's guest virtual hardware. And then on top of that, we install a guest operating system. This might be Windows XP, something 32-bit for older machine support. Or maybe you have Windows XP and then you also have Windows 7. This is, like I said, this is what I do. Now we can repeat this process as many times as we want. Once it's virtual, we can copy and paste and make a billion of them. And the only limit to being able to do that is, again, memory. So that's why I talked about RAM and hard drive space when we were picking hardware, is because, first of all, when your virtual machine is running, it does take real RAM. It maps your virtual memory onto your physical memory. Now, a virtual machine doesn't really need as much RAM as what you would normally consider a programming machine needing, because normally when you have a programming machine, you want to be able to run your operating system, run your programming software, and at the same time run your email, run your web browsers, run your PDFs, and all sorts of other things. And on a virtual machine, we don't really need that. So usually I say somewhere in the 2 gig range seems to work pretty well for a virtual machine because we're not running that much on it. If I start running bigger applications, maybe I'll go to 2.5 or 3 gigs. But really, I haven't had any need to go higher than that. The second piece of this is hard drive space. So RAM makes a difference when the virtual machine is running, or when the virtual machines, plural, are running. Hard drive space makes a difference whether it's running or not. And this is the same as any physical computer you might have. That hard drive has the operating system and software installed on it whether the thing is turned on or not, where your RAM only has something in it when it's turned on. And again, when we're talking about a virtual machine, you don't have all sorts of other things installed on it. You have the operating system and you have the programming software. So you really don't need as much hard drive space for a virtual machine as you would normally think you would need for a physical machine. What I find usually having on my virtual machines is somewhere around 10 to 15 gigs for an older Windows XP machine, and something like 20 to 25 gigs of real physical hard drive space to be able to have a Windows 7 machine. Now, the more snapshots I have, the more things I have installed, it definitely gets bigger from there. That's just kind of a baseline. Okay, that's enough theory. Let's make it actually happen. I'm going to go to vmware.com and I'm going to get my software. So if we look over here, there's a products tab. I click on that and I'm looking for VMware Workstation Pro. Workstation Player doesn't have the snapshot feature, and if you can't tell, I am a big fan of that. So let's go with Pro. Go ahead and say buy online, or you can try it for free. I think it's a 30-day trial. And go ahead and install it and follow the prompts. It's very easy installation. Okay, now that we've got Workstation installed, it probably looks something like this. And to make a new virtual machine, I'm going to click on this huge button that says Create a New Virtual Machine. And there's a nice little wizard. I'll go with the typical settings and click Next. And I prefer the extra control I get from installing the operating system myself, so I'm just going to do that. If you want to, you can have an installer disk or image here, and it'll actually install the operating system while it creates the virtual machine. Might save you a little time, but again, I prefer the control of just doing it myself. So I'm going to click Next on that, and it's going to ask what kind of guest operating system it's going to be, because it'll set it up to perform best with that operating system. So I'm going to say it's Microsoft Windows, and just for this example, I'm going to do Windows XP Professional, and we'll say Next. Now you can give it whatever name you want. I'm going to leave it like that because why not? And then I prefer, just for the sake of having a good place for virtual machines, inside my C drive, I have a VMs folder. Each VM is just a collection of files in a folder. So those files are going to live in whatever folder I select here. And for a new VM, I would typically create a new folder, which I've already done here. I will click Next. Now we've got two options here for the hard drive. It can store the hard drive in multiple files, which would make it easier to transport later if we want to move it to a different computer so that we don't have to have a humongous flash drive. Or we can store it as a single virtual disk file, and that's I'm going to choose the single file because as things get bigger, this is better performing than having the multiple files. I'm going to click Next, and notice here the memory. It assumed we only want a ½ gig. I'm going to change that. I'm going to click on Customize Hardware, and you can either drag this around up to 2 gigs, 2048, or you can just type 2048 right in here. And click OK, and so we end up with 2 gigs there. So that's great. So I'm going to say Finish, and look at how fast that was. Instant. That's all it takes to make a virtual machine. Next time we're going to talk about installing the operating system and setting it up for optimal performance when programming automation. See you then.